I'm Tim Byrne. This is Tim Byrne Almost Live. I'm your Wednesday night drive home. I had the luxury and the experience to go to RVH's gala last year and meet our lovely mayor of Barrie, Ontario, Canada. And part of that deal was to have lunch with him. And I didn't actually want to have lunch with him. I wanted him to come on my podcast so I could drill him on a whole bunch of political questions. Yeah. Mr. Mayor, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Great to see you.
And I know your time is precious. I have a pile of questions. And funny enough, I because of the prelude up to this, I was telling everybody that I was going to be interviewing Mr. Mayor. Yeah. And I said, what questions do you want me to ask? And people asked me silly things. And I said, drill down to some of the serious stuff. And when I sat around with a bunch of gentlemen that were either involved in development or just residents of the city, they started throwing a million things at me.
Oh, yeah. You'd be amazed at the questions we get in here.
Yeah. And politicians always have a tough time answering them because you're in a system that is set up for failure on an ongoing basis.
In a lot of ways. Yeah. Yeah. Well, but you know what the best thing about local government is there's no partisan politics in it. So you can be right or wrong regardless of who you are. And it's very personal. It's very pragmatic. That's what I like about it.
Do you think government does a good job spending money?
Not always. And there's a couple but we're better at it than most people think. Okay, so there is a lot of, you see a lot of stuff, especially on Facebook, of this is waste. Why are there 5 guys standing there lifting a that kind of stuff, right?
That's the standard.
But the reality of it is, especially today, because we have to be so completely transparent about how we spend money. And there are specific jobs out there, auditor general and ombudsmen and people like that, officers, table officers, whose job it is to evaluate whether we're spending money well. Plus, the other thing you got to remember is in a city like Barrie, we have a credit rating and we have a credit rating agency that comes in every year and looks at how we spend money. And if we're not being fiscally prudent, they're going to downgrade us, or at least we're going to get that language in the credit rating reports, which are very public and very important. So there's a lot more checks and balances than there used to be. I still think there are lots of things that government can do better and probably wastes money on mostly because we're resistant to change. That's the biggest waste is actually not, it's $700 when the city buys a hammer and it should be $7, the stuff you hear.
Right.
Now and again, something like that happens. And unfortunately, it perpetuates that stereotype. The bigger waste of money generally in government is still doing things the old way when there are newer ways, newer technologies, better ways to deliver a service, but you stick with some old out-of-date model and it ends up costing far more than it should.
The Saturday night argument around a dinner table always becomes, I find that government takes more time to make the decision than the actual task to execute.
Absolutely, often the case.
And that in itself, for a spectator looking in, you take a year to make a decision on something that only takes a month to complete.
Yeah.
And that to me looks like the largest waste is the decision-making process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess when it comes to the cost, the decision-making processes aren't all that expensive, except where you get into like endless sort of rounds of public consultation where you're holding events and launching websites and having hearings and things like that. That can get really expensive. The wheels of government sometimes move slowly. I think here we're a little bit more agile than the provincial and federal governments because we're able to change the agenda week by week to deal with whatever the issue is that comes up. But part of the reason stuff takes a long time, and this was a big thing for me because I came out of running my own business, right? And I was shocked.
Private sector.
Yeah. No, and it was a startup. I was shocked when I came in at how long it took to get things done. And it still surprises me sometimes. The decision-making piece of it, though, a lot of the length of time is because we want to consult with the public, or we want to be very open about it, and we want to give time for people to be part of that process. So a little bit of it is, like at what cost democracy, right? Like if you want to have people involved in the decisions that affect their community, it's going to take more than 30 seconds to make them. I mean, decisions can get made right away when one person has all the power, but that's not our system.
Yeah, it's funny though. When you see a speed bump that costs $1,000 to put in, and town council, I'm not sure how much per hour it costs to sit around there with all the residual staff, and you go, I think you spend. I was guessing this with a couple of other business guys. Town council's worth $2,000 an hour.
Yeah. No, that's probably not far off.
Right. We were adding some math and which, by the way, doesn't, I sit on boards and I know the board sits for an hour and you're like, holy cow, this board is very expensive.
Yes, yeah.
But when a speed bump's up $1,000 and it's $2,000 an hour, you're like, that speed bump's really worth $3,000.
Yeah. Wow. And this, we had an example of this at our most recent meeting. We had a $3 billion capital master plan, like literally the master plans for all the public works we're going to do for 20 years. That's $3 billion. That item took us about 7 minutes. Then we had a crosswalk. Crosswalk is $7,000. And we talked about the crosswalk for almost an hour. And that is the stuff that will make you bang your head against the wall.
Right. Yeah.
But there's a reason for it. Here's the reason for it. Your average person has no idea whether that $3 billion is a lot or too little or too much. Like, right. Should it be $4 billion or $2 billion?
Right.
I don't know.
Nobody knows.
But they know $7,000 for a crosswalk sounds like a lot, or $20,000 for a chair, or whatever it is. Right.
Sure.
And so, and politicians who react to what they hear out there from the public often will spend more time on smaller things that seem like a symbol of either good spending or bad spending or something like that. I'm not saying it's not a good thing. In fact, it's a real problem. And for those people who watch us and say, how could you approve $3 billion in 7 minutes and then talk about a crosswalk there? You're totally right. The system is messed up that way.
Yeah. I'm not going to talk about Doug Ford because he influences the rest of Ontario drastically. And when he last year chopped city council arbitrarily in Toronto, really what he was doing was trying to speed up the execution of decision making by having less people talk about it. Do you think what he did was right? Sorry, it wasn't right for Mr. Tory, but globally, do you think trying to make the decision process simpler, faster?
I think he had the right goal and went about it the wrong way. I mean, it's Toronto Council, in my opinion, and I hate to speak ill of my colleagues. Toronto Council, the old council system, did get dysfunctional. There's no question. There were blocks of voters. There was a lot of grandstanding. And I think the councillors, because of that, you did end up with situations where probably council wasn't as efficient or functional as it could be. Reducing the number of people, it's going to help a little. The flip side of that is, if you're a resident and you want to talk to your councillor about some local issue, it's now twice as hard. So, okay, it's kind of like what's the purpose of your local council? The reason I think first of all, the Premier of Ontario shouldn't come in and tell cities how they should be governed. The people of a city should decide how they want to be governed. It's not for the Premier to do that. It's for the people of a community. But the other thing, the reason I think it probably wasn't the most effective move is if you really want to speed up decision making on Toronto Council or Ottawa Council or Barrie Council, there's a lot of great ways to do that. You can push some of those decisions out to different bodies, so you don't have 45 people debating it. You've got 5 and they have decision making authority, but they're just as accountable. So there's a lot of ways you can run things to work faster. I think that particular thing was much more about politics. Yeah.
Currently, right now in Barrie, 15% of the population works for some kind of social service or healthcare function.
Right. Yeah.
That's a huge amount of the population. And as a private businessman, I always say to myself, there's a certain turning point where government employees or government assisted paid, and I appreciate you can say, well, the garbage guys are subbed out, but they're still being paid through tax money.
Yeah, for sure.
So jobs that are paid through tax money don't produce profit.
Right.
And really, it's tax money paying for tax money.
Yep.
And there's a certain point where Portugal, Greece, and other countries went through. Yeah. They had too many government employees, 100%. And when you see the city of Barrie having 15% of the population work for some kind of social service or some kind of tax-based orientated payment, do you watch that breaking point and go, okay, we won't be able to collect enough taxes to pay for the social services that we're providing?
Sure. So you're totally right. I mean, wealth is generated by adding value through the activities of private sector companies. That's where the wealth comes from, that we all are able to enjoy the quality of life in Canada because we agree to, we pay our taxes. And some of those countries you mentioned, one of the biggest issues was they literally couldn't get people to pay their taxes because the tax rates were so high, they just dodged it, right? Canada people pay their taxes. So we may not be happy about the amount, but it provides us the services and quality of life we've got. In terms of Barrie, that 15%, it's, it may sound high, but consider that the hospital's located here. It's not in Springwater or Oro or Innisfil or anywhere else. So that's a regional center that's serving a population. Like, let's argue RVH's population, it serves probably 500,000 people.
Okay.
So, when you sort of say that, okay, you got all these other. It
delineates at 15%. It washes that 15%.
Sure. But I think the overall issue you're talking about, which doesn't matter whether it's healthcare or education or any other social service or government employment, is when the burden gets high enough, the tax burden gets high enough to fund all of those services, which are delivered by people, then you start to be a drag on the economy because people go to lower tax jurisdictions to do their business if they can. And that's been a big issue for Canada, right? I mean, we talked about the brain drain to the US. We talked about the differential actually in healthcare employment, because you had people, physicians and others who went to the private system because they could get paid more. But then, we have this value in Canada that healthcare is accessible to everybody and we're all going to pay for it together. But we're not willing to pay doctors what they pay them in the States.
Right.
Anyway, the bigger issue here is how big should government be relative to the private sector? And yeah, we do watch that, because even if it's not something that a municipality can control, it's something that we're concerned about, because if you get a community where half of the employment is government, on some levels it may be more stable, but then when you get to a government that needs to cut, you're going to see a lot of those jobs go.
Does government do focus groups? Because my consensus in my little tiny group would be that we are currently taxed at the maximum as a society, and the socialistic behaviors that we've been having, and saying, dental should be paid for and university should be paid for, and everybody's going, well, where are we going to get this money from? And people are talking about super tax on the rich. Well, currently the rich right now is 80,000 or more, and your average household in Barrie is 97,000 a year. And you go, okay, I don't think those people want to pay another 4% or another 6%. And I think Canadians, barbarians are already at that point where they go, okay, I don't know how everybody wants all these things paid for. Yeah. How as a politician, you go, okay, there's a certain point where you talked about those countries dodging. Yeah. I think Canadians are at that cusp where they're going, I've had enough, and I've had enough being told that you're going to take more from me. And then when you go, what is rich? Well, theoretically, the highest income, the average high income earning is 83,000 in Canada. And you go, okay, but I know a lot of my friends that are living in households at the $100,000 range, and they don't think of themselves as rich people, but yet the Canadian government and provincial governments are talking about adding more tax burden to them. Sure. And as you get closer to that, I mean, the government takes on a focus group and goes, okay, I don't know if we can afford to do this. And I watched Doug Ford start cutting things lately, and people are chastising him. Yeah. But how do you keep paying for it when you don't, and Ontario's in debt badly? Yeah. And we share that burden, right? As a municipality, don't you share part of that provincial burden?
Yeah. No, we don't. We as a city can hold our own debt, or issue more or issue less.
Is Barrie in debt?
We are, but we have about 1/10 the amount of debt per capita that Ontario has.
Okay.
So for every person who lives in Barrie, there's $10 of provincial debt for every $1 of Barrie debt. And by the way, the Barrie debt is basically all for two things: our surface water treatment plant and our pollution plant. And the reason that's relevant is it's not tax supported debt. It's actually supported by development charges, which go on the price of new homes. So that debt is serviced by a fee that gets paid by everybody who buys a brand new home in Barrie, because the developer pays part of that fee. So that's the debt is not weighing on us the way Ontario's debt and Canada's debt is weighing on the rest of the provincial and federal budgets. Because, if you're spending 15 cents of every tax dollar servicing debt, that's 15 cents that you could be doing something else with, whether that's a tax cut in the opinion of some, or build another hospital or deliver good services, or whatever you could be doing. Instead, you're throwing that money at debt. And that's what we built up in Canada. I mean, and it's, what's frustrating to me is it seems to be, it doesn't matter what party it is. Like the greatest debt in Canada, the two prime ministers that racked up the most debt in Canada, Stephen Harper and Brian Mulroney, right?
Right.
Pierre Trudeau started it.
Yes, he did.
He really
Right.
did. And so maybe we blame him for saying,
it's okay to be in debt.
Governments are on this path, right? Exactly right. So, it's not really about party. It's this model of government that we seem to believe that you're never going to have to pay the bill. I mean, look at the U.S., look at the debt of the U.S. And everybody says, okay, the U.S. government's too big to fail. So that number's not even real. Well, really? I don't know. I think if we have a system of government, it doesn't matter whether you're in the wealthiest country of the world, the United States or Greece, your debt burden is going to catch up with you if government overspends and entitles people to money they don't have. So we don't do that around here. We have, this long-term debt that we're servicing on 2 water plants.
Do you ever get out of it?
Yeah, that gets retired. So it's like a mortgage. Municipal debt is either 10 or 20, and in very rare cases, we'll do a 40-year. I think we've got 1 40-year debenture. Everything else is either 10 or 20-year debt. So we just retired some last year. Our debt level actually went down last year because we retired some debt. So and you know what? It's also, though, about year after year, if you are not bringing in the money that you're spending, if you're actually deficit spending, which we seem to think is okay now, you're adding to it. I don't care what party is in charge. You're adding to the problem. You're making things worse for future generations.
Somewhere in the last 30, 40 years, we've convinced ourselves that governments are responsible for creating employment.
Okay.
Oddly. And so people talk about government should be helping making more jobs, make it easier to get jobs, make jobs. Yeah. But the truth is what government did, instead of trying to inspire private enterprise to make jobs, they started hiring themselves.
Okay.
And you think about it, a lot of things have turned into government agencies, employment, subcontracts to contracts. And the only really way for government to actually save money is to decrease headcount. And you talked about change and technology. I'm going to go back to that. So there's a lot of new technologies on the market that could decrease headcount. And I think we're in the middle of a technological revolution, whether it's Uber or whether it's downloading music now where we used to buy vinyl. Okay. And during that revolution, there's a moment where people are going to lose jobs, but new ones will be created. But that transition is hard on people. And I think government faces a problem because there's a lot of technologies out there that would possibly decrease headcount, which scares a politician to get back in power if they've got to cut jobs because they took on new software that's half the price of having a body there. And really anything done by humans repetitively, you could create technology for and eliminate that headcount. Do you think politicians have a tough time making that decision internally to go, okay, I got to cut headcount?
Yeah. And I've been so lucky as the mayor of Barrie because I've been insulated from it because we're a fast growing community. So what we've done
you're growing faster than your employment. Right.
Exactly. We hire a lot slower than the pace of growth in the community. So our net, our staff to population ratio has actually been dropping.
Oh, that's great.
Which is, in a way reducing headcount. But what I would say about that though is, some services are delivered by people. It's linear, right, man? Like if you got more roads, you need another
snowplow
driver, right on. If you've got 10,000 more people, you need another 5 cops, right?
Correct.
Or 5 firefighters. Sure. But if we have a service model, and this is where I guess I'd push back and say it's not really just about headcount. Government actually spends a lot of money on materials, utilities, doing things the way we do things today. Especially on capital. And, I think a lot of those things are areas where the new technology really can help. Ride sharing is going to transform everything, and not just ride sharing, but autonomous vehicles.
Right.
So we have a whole department and little business around parking, right?
Yes.
We charge for parking. We run parking lots. We clean them. We build some new ones. We have a parking garage, blah, blah, blah. We even market it. Parking is going to really change once autonomous vehicles come along. And I don't know if that's 10 years from now or 20 years from now, but you're not going to need parking lots when the car can drop you off and drive away
and leave. I had this conversation with somebody at the OPP, and we talked about traffic police that give out tickets.
Yeah.
And we talked about speeding cameras on all the bridges up the 400 highway, and not parking a cruiser there at $150,000 a year to give out tickets, but just put a camera at every bridge and give out tickets by email. And the cameras are $7,000 last 5 years. And government's too scared to go, yes, we don't need the extra 1,000 police officers to do traffic patrol because we can literally do cameras at the corners, cameras on bridges. The technology's there to eliminate those jobs. But I think every single politician's too scared to go, okay, I don't want to bring that technology in because I'm going to lose that tax base structure.
Yeah, I don't think it's about the money. I think with things like photo radar, it's just it ticks people off. So politicians don't want to issue more speeding tickets. I'm not sure it's the same.
But the difference is when an OPP officer pulls you over, you can't take the humanity out of the ticket giving. I once said to a Barrie police officer who pulled me over because he didn't like me when he came to the window, and he came back with 7 violations on a 15-kilometer over ticket. Okay. He came with a whole bunch, and I looked at him right in the face and I said, "You shouldn't be able to dispense the law in anger." Right. And if that was a computer generated ticket, there would be no emotional connection, and it would be the relationship to my error in my driving habits would have been directly dispensed by a impartial, unhuman technology that I couldn't argue. Yeah. And the cost of paying it, you just hook up PayPal and there's no more accounts receivable. And
no, for sure. So, take it one step further. I mean, the reality is, although you can't do this under privacy legislation today, the technology exists to just give everybody speeding tickets anywhere at any point, because we're all walking around with a smartphone that knows exactly where we are and how fast we're moving. Right. I mean, it would simply be a matter of using the software. Now that's a level of intrusion that, can you imagine the government, having that data? I know where you are at every second of the day because I'm going to use that data.
But the federal government tried to bypass Consensus Canada and wanted to have direct access into people's bank accounts.
Yeah, back to money laundering for terrorism was the motive. Right, you worry about that sliding into other motives, right? This is going to be a huge issue for us. And
the next 5-10 years, this technology thing is because we're going to have to learn how to cut costs with headcount.
Well, and like
push jobs back into the private sector and not have the government control them by using technology to do some of the repetitive tasks that humans do now. Whether it's driving a car, or whether it's giving out a speeding ticket.
I guess my take on it is this. Yes, government, there are limits on how much we as a society can take in terms of a tax burden. And there are limits, therefore, on what government can spend. I actually gave a major speech this morning to a business audience where I was saying, this is us, this is the circle. And if we raise taxes by, say, 1% somewhere, we're only going to nudge the circle out a tiny little bit anyway. So that's not going to solve some of the major issues affecting us as a society. Right. We need different kinds of solutions, not to just sort of little incremental tax increases or debt increases or whatever it is to pay for it. But I guess what I'd say too, though, about services, a lot of those things, I really don't believe in privatizing public services, because then you introduce a profit motive and it all just ends up costing.
No, but you can automate them so you can lose the headcount.
You can automate, then absolutely.
In comparison, so you wouldn't lose control of it. Yeah. You would just automate it so you didn't need the headcount, which is a very scary thing for government, because government wants to keep it. Wants to keep that, be. Right?
And like I said, here in Barrie, we've been very lucky in the sense that we have 1,000 employees. Between police, fire, and the 58 other services that you get for your property taxes, right? But we only grew that base by 9 people last year, even though the city's growing by about 2% a year, right? So by automating, we're able to do that.